Um, Tonight, two subjects to talk about. One is a model of consciousness. By the way, you probably know that there's a lot to talk about as far as consciousness is concerned. And basically, my preference is to talk about things that have some kind of empirical or anecdotal evidence to back up, as opposed to just make some statement, about the nature of consciousness that has no backing in any kind of scientific sense whatsoever. So that's what my leaning is. So hopefully, you know, somewhere in all the things that I talk about, at someday they will all be vindicated in a laboratory somewhere. Or so, anyways, that's where I'm coming from. Okay, so two parts tonight, but as always, I have a 10-minute meditation. So if you'd like to either turn off your phones or mute your microphone so we don't disturb anybody, I'll do the same for mine. If I can find out. Okay, there we go. All right, so 10-minute meditation. It's the same one where insight meditation, where we look into ourselves. So here we go, 10-minute meditation.
Allow yourself to get into whatever position feels most comfortable to you. And when you're ready, lovingly close your eyes. Invite your awareness to start to gather inwards, becoming the observer of your breath and body, just noticing without any judgment. And if judgment comes up, perhaps just saying, or I noticed that. And then continuing to simply be present with what is. Invite the breath to feel soft and natural, flowing as freely as it wishes, and yet still at a pace that somehow feels soft and gentle. Observing how both can be true at the same time. And on your next in-breath, now allow yourself to breathe in extra deeply, taking in that deep sip of air, holding it whenever you reach the top. And when you're ready, exhale with a sigh, really letting go in that exhale. And at the bottom of that deep exhalation, just allow the breath to go back to whatever pace was feeling so good to you. Affirm to yourself, I relax. I let go. I go within now. Tune into the weight of gravity. Intentionally allowing any muscles you do not need to use right now to become slack, to let gravity do its job. And as you feel your body releasing and relaxing more deeply, you flow deeper within. Try Trust where your awareness flows, whether it seems to go to your heart or your belly, perhaps your mid-torso. Find a space within you that feels really good for you to rest your awareness in. And now, spend just a few more breaths being completely present with this space and this space alone. Now find within this space a spark of light and enter within it. Notice how as you do, it appears as though you have entered into the vastness of the universe. It's as if that spark of light itself is the entire infinite nature of life itself. Is it possible infinity is within you? Feel your body respond with the lightness, signifying truth for you. Sense your awareness as vast as the universe. You may even feel as though your awareness is whooshing around, moving from one space to another, one galaxy to another, one nebula to another. Your awareness may be zipping around. Try not to hold on to it and let it flow. Recognize this feeling of how you can be everywhere at once. Is it possible the universe is within you? Breathe into a sense of lightness and how this feels. Honor your recognition. Affirm to yourself, I am that I am. And begin to become aware of the sensation that your human form, the one that you are currently connected to, the one you're experiencing life through. Feel how it exists within you. Affirming I am in me. With the I signifying the body and the me signifying how vast you truly are. If this were your universe, and I believe it is, how would you make it? What would you choose? if all things are possible, and I believe they are, what would you choose? Feel the totality of you beyond your human form. Feel it gathering the resources that your human requires to be so fully expressed. To feel lit up, fully alive. You may stay in the energy of this practice for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come out of this, do so by very slowly taking your time. Wiggle your fingers and toes. Open your eyes very slowly. And see your world with new eyes.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. You know, as I get older, my hearing isn't as great as it used to be. And e- even though I think, I had the volume turned up to an appropriate level, I had difficulty discerning exactly what she was saying. And then it occurred to me, it doesn't really matter what she's saying, because the whole purpose of the exercise was to experience the first person perspective, what subjectivity is all about. So whether or not you heard her exact words or not really doesn't matter. It gave you a chance to introspect and to really pay attention to your first person subjectivity, which is, of course, what we're investigating in this whole 8-week class. So anyways, just wanted to bring that up.
It was a great meditation. I really enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, I always like it. Always feel refreshed. And it always reminds me that just as we go outside, and go outside planet Earth and we go into the other planets in our solar system and beyond to other stars and other galaxies or whatever, which is essentially infinite. When you go into interspace, it's also essentially infinite and full of potential. So anyways, okay. Tonight we're going to get a little bit technical. And again, my purpose is that what we're going to talk about tonight is a whole course or several courses in themselves. I intend to do an overview so you have a feel for what's going on as far as consciousness research is all about. But one of the things that I'd like to point out is this chart was produced by Robert Kuhn. If you're not familiar with Robert Kuhn, he has a program on one of the streaming channels. I don't know if it's not the Discovery Channel. I can't think of what it is, called Closer to Truth, where he has interviewed almost every single person that is doing research on all the different schools and trying to understand the nature of consciousness. He put this chart together, or I'm sure people on his staff did, and you can see that at the current point in time, this chart may be a couple years old, I don't know for sure, there's over 350 theories of consciousness. It's absolutely incredible. And if it tells you nothing else, It tells you that we really don't have a good handle on consciousness, what it is, um, you know, how it operates, and what the underlying nature of consciousness really is. So, and you can see here what they span. One of the things that I'd like to point out, you probably all heard the expression that Richard Feynman, one of the physicists who made some significant advances in quantum field theory, said that if you think you understand quantum physics, you really don't. And because people don't really understand it, even though it's one of the most accurate theories we have in all of physics, as far as making predictions about how subatomic particles behave, nobody really understands it. So you often hear the term like quantum consciousness. Well, we don't understand quantum physics. We don't understand consciousness. So maybe if you throw the two words together, uh, and we come up with a term called quantum consciousness, that sounds good, but nobody really knows what you're talking about. So I just say take it with a grain of salt. Anytime you hear the word consciousness as an adjective with any other word, um, it's really people saying they don't really know what it is. So, of all these 350 different approaches to what the nature of consciousness is, there's a few specific uh, contenders from a scientific point of view that either supports the nature of the reality that we seem to experience, is backed up by some kind of empirical evidence or at least anecdotal evidence, and explains most of the things that we encounter during our lives. The two leading candidates are something called global workspace, our global neuronal workspace, as it's sometimes called, an integrated information theory. I'm not really going to go into any, but the one that seems to have the most traction these days is integrated information theory, which is also known as IIT, integrated information theory. So before we get into models of consciousness, just a word on what models mean from a scientific perspective. What science is all about is modeling what nature does, how nature behaves. Science is not about what nature actually is. That is a huge distinction. The behavior of nature versus what it actually is, two different things. What something actually is the metaphysics. It exists below science. And metaphysics usually informs science because if it doesn't, scientific theories don't follow from your metaphysics, then your metaphysics is wrong. On the other hand, if the metaphysics appears to be right, it can provide science with directions on how to better understand the behavior of nature. So the point of models is not to define what nature is doing. I mean, what nature is, but what it's doing. It mimics nature's behavior. In a sense, it simulates nature's behavior. As Edgar Mitchell always used to say, the map is not the territory. And that is really critical. We have a theory called quantum physics right now, and there's 17 subatomic particles that make up everything that exists according to quantum physics. However, it is a model. There is no actual subatomic particle. Science has no way of knowing exactly what actually underlies nature. So when you talk about a fermion or a boson or whatever in atomic physics, you're talking about a model. You're not talking about nature the way it really is. Models don't represent the thing represented as it really exists. That is beyond the scope of science. That is really important. So here's two pictures. One is a picture of an actual village somewhere, and here's another one is a map of the village. Obviously, a model is like a map. it provides some description to help define what, in this case, a village might be looks like, how it's laid out, how many buildings are in it or whatever. But there's much information that a map cannot describe about what a village is, the population of the village, the average temperature, all kinds of things like that. So models are really important. They're useful for conceptual reasoning and for explanatory power. If you come up with a hypothesis, models help you determine how to do experiments, and you can see if the result of the experiment supports your hypothesis or your prediction, or if it doesn't. But it is not the thing in itself. So that is very important to remember in science. So symbolic thinking, using language, visual image, auditory images, and all these things, quantities are like how much something weighs, how fast something is moving, are representations of reality. They're not the reality in itself. Actual experience, the qualities are the actual thing. And of course, natural philosophers knew that in the 16th century when Galileo, demonstrated that planets orbit around the sun, not the Earth. And Descartes came up with a false separation between science and spirit. So the church would stay out of business of science and vice versa. And that way, scientists didn't have to worry about being burned at the stake for committing heresy. And of course, over time, people forgot that science produces models that describe how nature behaves, but it's not what nature is in itself. Again, that's where metaphysics comes in. So with that little background, the two leading theories of consciousness from a scientific perspective, global workspace theory and integrated information theory. I'm not going to go into global workspace theory because I think it's starting to fall out of favor. There was a friendly competition between the two groups, those proposing the global workspace theory and those proposing integrated information theory. And they came up with an experiment. And again, the whole purpose of an experiment is to predict the results based on the model that you're using. And how close does the prediction come to the experimental results? And with groups defining the experiments from these two different camps, and this happened about, a couple of years ago now, and the results were written up in various scientific journals. Integrated information theory was much better at its predictive value than the global workspace theory was. So I'll explain what they are in a minute. But one of the discoverers or creators of the integrated information theory was Giulio Tononi. He's a psychotherapist and a neurophysiologist at the University of Wisconsin. And he did a lot of collaboration with Christoph Koch, who is interviewed here in an informal interview. He was asked to describe what integrated information theory is. Now, a lot of this you probably won't grasp. You probably will get the basics of it, and that's all that I can hope for. But I will cover some of the things that Christoph talks about on the next few slides. But Christoph is a really brilliant guy. He's a very interesting guy to talk to. He's written several books on the nature of consciousness for the layperson that are really fascinating books based on some of the experimentation that he's done for an organization which you'll see which will come up on the screen in just a second. So here's Christoph. This is about an 8-minute video.
You've also worked with Giulio Tononi on integrated information theory of consciousness, IIT. Can you explain IIT for us?
It's a formal theory there are few examples of that. There's certainly almost no examples of that in neuroscience. it's a formal theory in a sense. It starts off with axioms. So it doesn't just say, well, I think the function of consciousness is planning, and therefore prefrontal cortex is involved. That's sort of a typical cognitive science, neuroscience story. And it may well be true to a certain extent. But this theory is very different. It starts out with consciousness. It says any conscious experience has certain properties, any experience, whether it's a dreaming experience or whether that's being in love or whether that's when you're having near-death experience. And any possible experience of any creature has sort of 5 properties. It's intrinsic, it's for itself, it's very specific, right? It is what it is, whatever it is. When I see you, it's a specific type of experience, which is very different from seeing my son, who's roughly your age, right? It's definite. There's certain things that are in it, and the vast majority of experiences are out there. And whatever's in it defines this particular experience. It's integrated, it's holistic, it's one experience, and it's structured. When I look at you, there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's neighborhood, there's distance relationship. And that's true for even when I smell something, or when I'm upset at something, the different aspect in that experience. And then it looks for a substrate that could mediate this experience by making this other fundamental step. It says what exists. This goes back to Plato. What exists is what can cause. Okay, so let's unpack that. So cause means I can be an agent of change. I can cause because of my, let's say I'm a neuron, or let's say I'm a transistor. My gate is open or my gate is shut, then current flows through or current doesn't. Electrical current flows through my transistor gate or it doesn't, and that can affect something downstream. That affects the next transistors. Or I'm a neuron. If the neuron fires, it sends out an action potential. It can cause other neurons to discharge neurotransmitter or to fire or not to fire. Right? So this is causal power. Gravity is causal power. Electric charge has causal power. So only what exists, only what has causal power, what can take a difference and make a difference. So in other words, you have to be affected by something in the world.
Let me just stop and interrupt for 1 second. When he talks about gravity or electric charge or magnetic charge or whatever has causal power and that it can affect something else, it cannot affect itself. Consciousness is different. It can make or take a difference. In other words, just as it can affect something external to itself, it can also affect itself. So that's, if it has causal power on itself, it's conscious. Very important distinction. One other thing well, let's continue and I'll get to the other thing in a minute.
World, and you have to be able to affect the world in order to exist. This is actually a widely used principle in physics, and we, if we want, we can go into the example of the ether. Now, this is so-called extrinsic power, extrinsic causal power for others. Consciousness exists to the extent it exerts causal power on itself. Because of the first axiom, conscious experience is intrinsic. It's for the person or for the thing that has the conscious experience. My conscious experience is intrinsic to me. You don't access it. I can talk about it, but ultimately it's this intrinsic conscious experience. So the theory says, well, now you look for, and causal power you can mathematically calculate if you have what's called the transition probability matrix, TPM, of any system. So it's substrate neutral. It's totally agnostic. Could be transistors, could be solar corona, could be brains, whatever. You have a mechanism where you have certain things in one state and some things in a different state. Could be binary, could be analog, could be deterministic, could be probabilistic. That doesn't affect the fundamental concept. It just affects your transition probability matrix. And causal power means that, let's say, these 3 neurons that are on, can influence those 17 neurons over there. And those 2 neurons over here can trigger something in this neuron over here. And you have to do that exhaustively for the entire system. This is its causal power. The ability of the system to be in the current state, it's always state dependent, by the way. So you have to take a brain like this to analyze what is its experience. It's not generic, it's specific to a mechanism like the brain in a specific state, meaning these neurons here and here and here are firing and the rest of the neurons are off, as an example. And then you analyze all possible relationships, causal relation among all possible elements, in this case neuron, and you look for the one that maximizes the intrinsic causal power. And you can use a mathematical calculus. It derives a number that some of you may have heard called phi, the Greek symbol phi. It's a pure number. It's not bits. Between 0 and practically speaking, infinite. I mean, very large. It's a real thing, a real number. And you look for the substrate that has the maximum cause effect power. It has to be different from 0. If it's 0, the system doesn't exist as a whole. It doesn't exist as a system. So the other way to think about it, which makes it a little bit easier, is phi, sort of irreducible complexity. If a system is reducible to something simpler, let's say if a system is reducible to 2 independent components, well then it doesn't exist as a system. It only exists as a subsystem. And then you have to analyze each of these. Does this one have phi different from 0? Does the other one have phi different from 0? And the theory says whatever is conscious in this particular system, let's say this, is the substrate that maximizes the integrated information, which doesn't include all neurons, because remember the theory says any experience is integrated. So you have to have all neurons sort of connected to each other, not all to all, but they have to causally interact with each other. And so if something is too big, it's just like an empire here on planet Earth, you lose sort of causal control over the distant regions and they go off and do their own thing, like in any large empire that starts breaking up when the central hegemonic power loses its influence. So so that's what the physical substrate of consciousness is. And the way it feels like something, so how conscious the system is described by this number phi. So you can have some systems that are phi is 2, or others where the phi is 2 trillion. The other thing you have to look at, as I mentioned, all the causal structure. You unfold the causal structure of the system by considering all possible subcomponents. These 2 neurons acting on those 17, those 3 acting on those 5. And that's a very, very, very large number. It scales as 2 to the 2 to the n. So if you have a brain that has 10 neurons, that's 2 to the 2 to the 10, that's 2 to the 1,000. That's vastly bigger than, there are only 10 to the 70 atoms in the universe. So it scales very, very quickly to vast numbers. And the theory says what you experience, the way space feels different from being in love, from smelling, Limburger cheese, is ultimately the causal structure, this intrinsic cause-effect structure of all the unfolded causal relationship of a mechanism in a state. It's quite a radical claim because it says it maps one to one. Everything in this unfolded form, this unfolded structure, all the causal relationship of this particular system in this particular state maps onto conscious experience, and every aspect of conscious experience finds its counterpart in this particular structure. It's a one-to-one mapping. It's not an identity relation. They map onto each other one-to-one. So it says ultimately what consciousness is, it's a structure. It's a form. It's a causal structure. It's a form. It's not a computation. It's not a clever hack. It's not a process. It's not a brain pattern activity. So it's very different from, for better or worse, than every other theory of consciousness. Functionalism.
I'm going to stop it right there. And I want to go back. And what does he mean by integrated information? I forgot to mention it on this one chart right here. You've probably all seen this picture before. This is 2 faces looking at each other from one point of view. But if you look at it from another point of view, it's a vase.
Uh-huh.
And, or actually it's both at the same time. That's with the maximum amount of integrated information. That's what he's talking about when he talks about integrated, how much information is integrated. And that's what you're aware of in your conscious mind at any one point in time. So let's let's go here. And I'm just going to mention some of the high points. I don't expect you to remember this. By the way, this latest version has been uploaded to the website. If you go under resources, the menu item resources on any of the web pages, and then go down to presentations, you will find theories of consciousness or a presentation on consciousness. You can download this whole thing. And I usually updated it before every class. So what it's saying, by the way, the IIT model of conscious doesn't require a certain metaphysics like materialism or idealism or any other form. It's metaphysically neutral, which is important because that says that it can be applied to whatever your metaphysics is. So to be under IIT, to be conscious is to possess and integrate information. Okay. Consciousness states are highly differentiated and information rich, and experiences integrated as a unified whole. It starts with the basic given. We know we're all conscious, right? I know I'm conscious. I think you know that you're conscious, right? And it accounts for the qualities of experience by certain states of neurons scattered throughout the substrate, in this case, a brain, that defines each unique quality that you experience or qualia. That is very important, as we'll talk about in a minute. Because of the way it operates, it provides a map between what you experience subjectively and what a third person perspective sees. If they could put as many electrodes into your brain and determine what the states of all your neurons were and all their inputs and outputs, right? So why is that important? Well, we mentioned before, if somebody has locked-in syndrome, they've been in an accident, they're on a respirator, they can't move any muscles in their body, they can't talk, they can't even blink their eyes. You know, if you put an EEG cap on them and you can measure the firings of neurons in certain critical areas of the brains, you can still find out if they're conscious or not and see if they have subjective experiences. Another use for this model is if somebody has physiological pathology or a psychological pathology, you can actually treat patients by knowing the neurological pathways that are involved in that particular pathology. That's one big area of investigation right now. Another one is direct neurological interfaces. Like there's a company called Neuralink right now that Elon Musk is funding, which basically allows paraplegic and quadriplegics to control devices outside of themselves by studying the neuronal firings within the brain. So, of course, another big area is in ethics or whatever. If you're trying to decide whether somebody is locked in or not, if they are having a conscious experience, you certainly don't want to pull the plug if they're conscious, even if they can't move any muscles, unless, of course, they say they don't want to live in that kind of a state anymore. So the important thing about IIT is to remember, it does a mapping between first-person subjectivity, what something feels like, what an experience feels like, and what the substrate is doing, in this case, the brain, all the neurons that are firing that create are correlated with that particular state. So if you can, if you know one side, according to the theory, you know what's happening on the other side. So in other words, if you look at the electrical signals in certain areas of the brain, you know what their first person perspective is at that moment in time. And of course, they're even speculating that animals with a brain, have similar first-person perspectives as far as emotions as human beings do. So in a way, we may someday be able to use this theory to communicate with animals that can't talk to us and tell us what's going on inside of them. So the potential for IIT is very powerful. This next chart is too detailed. I'm not going to go into it, but it starts with a bunch of assumptions. The first assumption is it starts with consciousness, that anybody that has a brain is conscious, okay? And then it describes the 5 characteristics of conscious experience. And from that, it translates those axioms, those assumptions, into mathematical characteristics of the conscious system. And from that, you can go between the first person perspective and the third person perspective back and forth. So if you know one side, you can infer the other side and vice versa. And the degree which something is conscious is this number called phi, which can be calculated. And the higher the phi, the more conscious that individual or that conscious entity is. And to do that, it relies on something called a transition probability matrix. Each row and column is literally one input to a neuron. And there are, 85 billion neurons, each with 50,000 inputs and outputs. So a huge amount. The mathematics is incredibly large. And some people think it's a pseudo theory, not a real theory, because the numbers are too large to actually deal with. However, they have a way around that problem using statistical averages for significant portions of the substrate, in this case, the human brain. So anyways, that's what IIT is. And again, here's the two sides. The one is the actual subjective experience, and it corresponds to neuronal states and all the synapses and axioms and dendrites that are firing. And so if you know the experiential states, you know the neuronal states and all the inputs and outputs, and vice versa. If you know all these neuronal states, you know what that individual is experiencing. So it's a mapping between these two sides. Very potentially to be very powerful. So the applications, and this is the last slide I'm going to talk about IIT. Again, we can make a whole course on this if you want to go into the details. But if somebody has locked-in syndrome, they've been in an accident and have no motor control over any aspect of their body, it allows for the possibility of understanding what somebody's subjective state is, what they're experiencing, their level of consciousness, just by looking at neuronal activity and the synapses. And so you can identify and communicate with locked-in patients. You can identify and treat psychological and physiological pathologies and related disorders, because you know what it should be in a normal person and how patterns may differ, or in a person who has some kind of pathology. I mentioned before Neuralink providing links to external devices, whether it's somebody who's a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, that can support and make devices move that helps his body move, or for a fighter pilot in a jet plane, where the reaction time has to be so short that they don't have time to move their hands and just need to think of what they want the plane to do next. And so eventually, I mentioned before, even non-human communications with other organisms understand what they're actually experiencing. So anyways, that's a very brief, high-level view of the predictive value of IIT. The mathematics is really involved if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty. I don't advise it unless you're really interested in it. Okay. At the beginning of tonight, I talked about metaphysics. And I don't mean in a New Age sense. I mean metaphysics in a philosophical sense. Metaphysics is basically attempts to describe what the nature of reality is. Science is about how nature behaves, what it does. So metaphysics is about being, and science is about doing, what nature does. Metaphysics about what nature is. And as shown here on the bottom. So this is in a philosophical sense, metaphysics of the study of what nature actually is. The nature of reality might be a better way to say this. Science studies what nature does. And that's why models are so important, because if you understand what nature does in certain circumstances, then you can develop technologies and get nature to do what you want it to do by following the rules that nature has established for how it does things. It does it by using models. So anyways, metaphysics is the underlying reality of what the world, how the world actually works. And we have no way through science to understand that. So I mentioned before, when quantum physicists talk about their models of the 17 particles that make up quantum physics. Those are models. They are not what reality actually is. They may be good approximations in some cases and poor in others. I'll give you another example of a model. And, Galileo and Newton first came up with the concept of gravity, that this invisible force that could act at a distance and attract two bodies together. The French Science Academy at the time that Newton published his theory of gravity, they laughed for 50 years. They said, how could something that you can't observe, that's invisible, affect something at a distance? And eventually, through scientific experiments, they proved that Newton was in fact correct. Well, come along in the 20th century, we sent men to the moon, and the theory wasn't that accurate. It couldn't account for variations in the orbit of Mercury, the planet closest to the sun, because of the effect that the sun's gravity had on the orbit of Mercury. So Einstein came up with his theory of general relativity that says that no, a new model of gravity, it warps space and time. It's not an invisible force that acts as a difference. And guess what? It was able to more accurately predict the nature of, the orbit of Mercury around the sun. Newton's model was still accurate enough to put a man on the moon with minor course corrections along the way. And now, with the latest, scientific studies and so on, even Einstein's theory of general relativity is no longer correct. And scientists are now looking at something called quantum loop gravity, which is a more accurate model of the way nature works. Again, in all cases, we came up with models. They mimic what nature does, but they do not describe what nature is. Something very important not to forget. So the mainstream model that affects all aspects of society is physicalism. Physicalism is the modern word for materialism. It just includes quantum field theory, along with everything that Newton and scientists of the previous centuries had already discovered. It basically says that everything in reality is composed of matter, physical particles, matter and energy. And brains, by the way, are made up of matter and energy, and consequently, consciousness is an epiphenomena, a byproduct of the processing of the neurons and the electrochemical behaviors that take place in human brains. Okay. In other words, when the brain dies, when the body dies, that's the end of consciousness according to materialism. The primacy of matter, consciousness is an epiphenomena. All experienced qualities, the feeling of love, the smell of a rose, the taste of garlic, all these things are qualities that only occur in the brain. That's what materialism says. However, there are many things in the human experience that have come to light in the last 100 years or so that basically materialism has no explanation for. And consequently, they ignore that most of these things even exist. I'll give you an example, psi phenomena, for example. How can two brains, let's say my brain and Martha's brain, communicate with each other over long distances without being physically present or using some device like a telephone or something to communicate? It's well known. There are thousands or maybe millions of cases by now documented that especially people that have an emotional connection can communicate over vast differences, particularly when somebody, a loved one, is in trouble. They're in an accident or something. Near-death experiences. Well, consciousness says, well, when the brain dies, and it goes flatline, because there's no activity in the brain, you can't be having an experience. So it's all hallucination. It can't possibly be real. So the materialist approach to anything that doesn't fit in the materialist metaphysics is it's wrong. It doesn't exist. It's a hallucination. So therefore, it's not real. Reminds me of Galileo when he went to the church fathers with a telescope and said, look at this. Jupiter is a planet. It has moons around it and it orbits around the sun. Look through the telescope and see for yourself. And the response was, we don't have to look through the telescope. We know what you're saying can't possibly be true. So I think, fortunately, we're a lot further along than that, but it's so ingrained in the culture. We make all these assumptions that materialism is true. We don't even realize we're making the assumptions, and consequently, we're ignoring a lot of evidence and experimental possibilities that might confirm something that we think is impossible. So, the emerging metaphysics, and there's lots of different theories out there, is that consciousness is fundamental in the universe. Basically, that everything in the universe that exists is not physical particle or energy, but it's a mental construct. It exists in a mind. Well, the first question that we'll come up with, well, whose mind? Well, as we'll find out next week when we get into the details of some of these alternative metaphysics, idealism postulates that there's a cosmic mind. And basically, there is only one mind, and we are all disassociated entities of that one mind. And I'll explain that more in detail next week. So the major consciousness schools right now is the first one is dualism. That is that matter exists and mind exists, and the two are separate. Just like Descartes convinced the church 400 years ago. Panpsychism is another approach that everything, including the smallest particles in nature, subatomic particles, and everything that composes them, is conscious to some degree. And then there's idealism that says that we are all differentiated aspects of a universal cosmic consciousness. And of course, that's what many of the ancient.
I'm on a conference call, but I put myself on mute. Go ahead.
Okay. That the ancient Eastern traditions basically are pretty close to idealism.
Oh,
Brian, you forgot
I
you're
put
not
it out
muted.
to the Valerie, Dave, Kevin, and Susan, and
Uh,
you. So if it's of interest to you,
Let me see
text
if I can
Valerie and
mute
just say,
him.
has any
Okay. He thought he put himself on mute and he didn't. Okay. So how do you evaluate a metaphysical theory to see if it really carries any weight and it might hold some aspect of truth about it? You can't conduct an experiment on what nature actually is, only what it does. That's science, right? But does it support existing scientific theories? And we'll talk about some other criteria for evaluating metaphysical theories next week, and you'll get a better understanding on why the emerging metaphysical assumptions is that consciousness is fundamental in the universe. And we'll have a lot more details on that in the next section. This happens to be a news article that was published in Association for, I don't know, I forget what the I stands for. It's a physics scientific journal, Physics Advances. And basically, this is an article they published. This was on January 2nd, 2025. New study claims universal consciousness existed before the Big Bang and still shapes our reality. And by the way, I don't mean metaphysical metacognition, which is the ability to re-represent things, but I mean phenomenal conscious, the ability to have a experience. And we'll talk about the differences again next week. So, anyways, this is the emerging paradigm, and it's getting more and more support all the time. There is so much information right now that basically, I think I might have mentioned one of the leading proponents of idealism, Bernardo Kastrup, has written 15 books on the subject. And he used to debate people all the time, scientists and people who believed in materialism or physicalism. And at first they would argue with him. And then he lately, I mean, he's very good. I mean, he's very quiet. He has very powerful arguments that he uses. He's very knowledgeable about science and philosophy and in from the neurosciences to quantum physics. And people cannot argue with him because they always lose the arguments. Very rarely will somebody debate him anymore about idealism. Okay, so along with the emerging metaphysics that consciousness is fundamental in the universe, this is something that was first proposed by Schopenhauer in the 1800s. It's the filter theory of consciousness, is that consciousness exists outside of us, right? Subjective experience, what something feels like, is not generated by the brain, but the brain merely selects it according to the body in space-time and what it in particular resonates with. So, and I mentioned before that there's lots of experiences that people have that cannot be described, way too many, and materialism can no longer ignore them. Fainting caused by asphyxiation, where people lose oxygen to the brain, basically, and the brain activity really slows down. And if you believe in materialism, well, consciousness is a result of brain activity. Well, if you have no brain activity, how can you have these incredible transpersonal experiences when somebody is in a state of asphyxiation? G-force, it's called G-lock, loss of consciousness, is what pilots go through. Ed Mitchell went through it when he was training to be an astronaut. They put him in a centrifuge and spin him around so he can experience what a G-force of 10G is like. It causes all the blood to be drained from the brain. And in that process, the astronauts in training experience, transpersonal states of consciousness. Stan Groff and his holotropic breath work by breathing your own exhalations, which is mostly carbon dioxide, also causes loss of oxygen to the brain, where people experience transpersonal states. Psychedelic experiences is another one. And I should mention that Christoph Koch, the guy who was talking a couple of minutes ago, he was a hardcore materialist 20 years ago. And he had more and more difficulty explaining various aspects of consciousness over time. You know, the more he got into his experiments and the people who worked for him. And eventually he took ayahuasca on a beach in Brazil, and he had his own personal experience, which is covered in his latest book, Now I Am Myself, the World, where he describes his experience. And I think in an earlier slide, I even had a slide where he described what his experience was like. Well, he has become an idealist as well. It's the only thing that he believes can explain the experience that he had on that beach in Brazil. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is where you take an intense magnetic field and you literally ring the brain and see how it responds. It also produces things that cannot be described by brain activity. You know, and there's we talked earlier about acquired savant syndrome. How could that possibly work when large parts of the brain are destroyed due to either birth trauma or physical trauma later in life, near-death experiences, and so on? So all of these things, and we don't have time to go into them now, but maybe at the very end of the course, we can spend more time talking about some of these things and why they seem to indicate and support the notion that consciousness resides beyond the brain. And we'll cover this in much more detail next week when we talk about the metaphysics of idealism. Okay, so, and here is idealism, the emerging worldview. In this case, mind is fundamental and matter is a byproduct. And how could that possibly be, you would ask? Well, the best explanation I ever heard was from Bernardo Kastrup when he described at night when you go to sleep and you dream yourself to be the dream avatar. That is, you are the principal person in the dream, but you are interacting with all kinds of other people, objects, animals, whatever, in the dream. Okay, and then you wake up and you recognize that everything that took place, the dream avatar and all those other objects in the dream, all took place in your mind while you are in the dreaming state. Well, the mind that I'm talking about is what we refer to as cosmic consciousness. And there's a very specific aspect of it called mind at large. And we'll differentiate between cosmic consciousness and mind at large in next week's session. So basically, the metaphysics of idealism says that everything is made out, everything that we experience is made out of mental constructs. This glass right here is not physical. We think it's physical because this is our model of reality, what we think it to be. It's actually a mental construct. And is it a mental construct in my mind? Well, yes, to some degree, but it's also a mental construct in the universal mind or cosmic consciousness. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail about what that means. And of course, if we are all differentiated aspects of cosmic consciousness, disassociated aspects of cosmic consciousness, I should say, it explains things, well, why ESP might exist, Well, the barrier that separates my subjective experience from your subjective experience, nothing in nature is perfect. Well, things may leak across that barrier. And, it's a very simple explanation for how ESP or telepathy or, near-death experiences and all these transcendent states could actually occur, for which physicalism or materialism has no explanation for. So, the metaphysics, again, what nature actually is, and science is about what nature does. It develops models to make predictions so that you can then build technologies that implement those models to control what nature is going to do. So anyways, I think this is probably the last slide. Let me just verify that. Yeah. Next week, we will get into the details of the metaphysics of idealism, what it actually is, what it seems to suggest reality is made of, and what are the implications for it. And of course, one of the obvious implications, which I will bring up now, which is absolutely, critical, is that when your body dies, an aspect of your consciousness does not. Where's it going to go? It existed before your body was born, and it will exist after your body is long gone. But sort of like the dreamer in the example I gave before, will you mourn the fact that your physical body has died any more that you mourn the fact that the dream avatar is gone when you wake up? I don't think so. You'll just go on to a different realm of existence, and you will reintegrate with a larger cosmic mind. So this is a good place to stop right here. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about, and we'll explore these in much more detail next week.